The rain had fallen all night over Whitby, leaving the narrow cobbled streets slick with reflections of gas lamps. Inside the old clockmaker's shop on Church Street, every clock had stopped ticking. Clara Harrington stood among them, her hands trembling slightly. The air was thick with dust and oil, and the familiar scent of brass polish brought tears to her eyes. Her father, Arthur Harrington, had been gone for a week now. The funeral was over, the mourners had left, yet the silence inside the workshop felt heavier than any grave. On the long oak bench lay his unfinished work, a mantel clock with golden hands and a dial carved with delicate roses. Beside it, a set of tools rested exactly as he had left them. Clara reached out and touched the bench. "He always said time never really stops," she whispered. But now, every clock in the shop had fallen still at precisely 3 minutes past midnight, the exact moment her father died. As she moved around the room, her eyes caught a faint glimmer beneath a pile of ledgers. Curious, she pulled them aside and found a small wooden box locked with an ornate keyhole. The box was engraved with an emblem she did not recognize, a pair of wings wrapped around an hourglass. She searched for the key but found none. Instead, she noticed an envelope resting beneath the box. On it, her name was written in her father's neat handwriting, "To my dearest Clara, when the ticking stops." Her heart began to pound. She tore the envelope open, revealing a single note. It read, "There are things I could not tell you in life. You will find the answers in the clock that does not belong to us. Be careful with time, it listens." At that exact moment, a faint tick echoed from the farthest corner of the shop. Clara turned her head sharply. Among the silent clocks, one had begun to move on its own. It was a small pocket watch, its brass surface tarnished, its face cracked, but it was ticking steadily, as though keeping time for something, or someone. Clara picked it up, and as her fingers brushed the cold metal, she noticed a name engraved along the rim. Eleanor Vale. And before she could take another breath, the hands of the watch shifted on their own, and the workshop's door creaked open, though no one was there. The following morning, the mist from the harbour drifted through the narrow streets of Whitby, curling around doorways and windows like pale smoke. Clara sat at the wooden counter of the workshop, the pocket watch before her. It ticked faintly, steady as a heartbeat, though she had not wound it once. She had barely slept. The door had opened on its own the previous night, yet when she stepped outside, no one had been there, only the wind and the echo of waves crashing below the cliff. Clara opened the watch again. The engraved name Eleanor Vale gleamed faintly in the dim light. She ran her finger over the letters. "Who are you?" she whispered. In the drawers of her father's desk, she found old receipts, sketches of gears, and several black and white photographs. Most were of clocks and customers, nothing unusual, until she found one that made her breath catch. It showed her father, Arthur Harrington, standing beside a woman with soft curls and a serious gaze. Written on the back in faded ink were the words, "Whitby, 1898 Eleanor." Clara stared at the photograph. The date was from before she was even born. Her father had never mentioned anyone named Eleanor. A sharp creak startled her. One of the tall grandfather clocks against the wall had begun to sway slightly, though the air was still. The pendulum swung once, twice, and stopped midair, frozen. Then, a faint voice seemed to drift from the brass horn of the gramophone in the corner. It was soft, fragile, almost like a whisper. "Arthur." Clara's blood ran cold. The gramophone had no record on it. She approached it cautiously. The horn trembled, and the voice came again, clearer this time. "Clara." She stumbled backwards, knocking over a small clock. The pocket watch on the counter began to tick faster, louder, until the sound filled the room. The photograph slipped from her hand, falling face down to the floor. And there, beneath the photograph, was another envelope that had not been there before. Her name was written again, but in a different handwriting, more elegant, more delicate. It said, "For the daughter he never told me about." Clara's breath hitched. She slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in that same graceful script. Arthur promised me time. But time was never his to give. And at the bottom, barely legible, were the words that made her knees weaken. Meet me where the tide ends. As she stared at the note, the distant church bells began to ring, though no service was scheduled that morning. And from outside, through the fogged glass window, she thought she saw a woman in a dark dress standing across the street, staring directly at her. The wind carried the salt of the sea as Clara made her way down to the shore. Whitby's harbour lay veiled in mist, the masts of the fishing boats swaying like ghostly sentinels. The note crumpled in her hand grew damp from the fog. Meet me where the tide ends. The words echoed in her mind. Her father's old stories of the coast came back to her, how the tide could reveal things that time wished to keep hidden. She followed the worn path past the churchyard and down to the stretch of beach beneath the cliff. The sea hissed softly, pulling pebbles back into its depths. Clara's boots sank into the wet sand. There was no one there, only the endless grey expanse of water and sky. Yet she felt it again, that strange pull, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. She reached the edge of the rocks where the tide was lowest. There, wedged between two boulders, she saw something gleaming, a pocket watch, almost identical to the one she had found in the workshop. But this one was open, its face shattered, and inside lay a photograph. Clara knelt down and brushed the sand away. It was her father again, smiling faintly beside Eleanor Vale. Only this time, Eleanor held the same pocket watch in her hand. A sudden chill ran through her. The air grew still, the waves seemed to pause mid-crash. Then, from behind her, came the faint crunch of footsteps on pebbles. She turned sharply. A woman stood a few paces away, her figure blurred by the mist. She wore a dark dress that clung to her as though damp with seawater. Her hair was the color of ash, her eyes distant but fixed on Clara. You found it, the woman said, her voice carrying through the fog like a whisper of wind. Clara's mouth went dry. Who are you? The woman tilted her head, and for a moment her expression softened into something almost sorrowful. Once, I was Eleanor Vale. Clara's heart skipped. The name, etched into brass, written on envelopes, whispered in the night, was now standing before her. You can't be, Clara murmured. You died. Eleanor finished, a faint, hollow smile forming. Time does not die, Miss Harrington. It waits. It remembers. The tide began to rise around them, the water licking at Clara's boots. She wanted to step back, but her body refused to move. Eleanor's gaze fell to the broken watch in Clara's hand. He made me promise I would not return until the clock stopped, she said softly. And now they have. What do you want from me? Clara whispered. Eleanor looked toward the horizon, where the sea met the fog. To finish what he began. He tried to mend time. But some things, once broken, should never be fixed. A gust of wind howled between the rocks, and the photograph slipped from Clara's hand, swept away into the dark water. When she looked up again, Eleanor was gone. Only her voice lingered in the wind, faint as the receding tide. Be careful, Clara. The next turn of the clock is yours. That night, the air inside the workshop felt different, thicker, almost watchful. The scent of oil and brass no longer comforted Clara, it made her uneasy, as though every clock on the wall was listening. She locked the door and placed both pocket watches on the counter, the one she had found in the workshop, and the broken one from the shore. The ticking from the first was still constant, the rhythm too alive for an object of metal and gears. Her father's note echoed in her thoughts. You will find the answers in the clock that does not belong to us. Clara glanced at the mantel clock her father had been working on before his death. Its golden hands gleamed faintly in the candlelight. For a moment, she thought she saw them tremble, shifting ever so slightly. She reached for the clock, and as she lifted it, she heard something inside, something loose, rattling. She turned the clock over. The back panel was sealed, but a faint crack ran through the wood. Taking a screwdriver, she pried it open. Inside was not a spring, nor a gear, but a tiny glass hourglass, its sand black as soot. It pulsed faintly, as though something within it still moved. Her breath quickened. A folded slip of parchment was wedged beside it. She carefully pulled it out and unfolded it. The handwriting was her father's. If time breaks, the hourglass will bleed. You must not let it run empty. Eleanor and I tried to bind it once, but we failed. If it empties completely, it will not be death that comes, but repetition. Clara stared at the black sand. Half of it had already fallen to the bottom. Suddenly, the candle beside her flickered violently. Shadows on the wall shifted, forming shapes that almost looked human. Then, somewhere upstairs, a clock chimed 13 times. 13. Clara froze. No clock was ever built to strike 13. She rose slowly and climbed the staircase, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The upper hall was dark except for a single door slightly ajar, her father's study. The sound was coming from within. She pushed the door open. The study was just as he had left it, books piled high, blueprints scattered across the desk. Yet something was wrong. The mirror on the far wall reflected not the room, but another scene entirely, the beach at Whitby, with fog swirling thick and heavy. And in that reflection, a woman stood where Clara should have been. Eleanor Vale. Their eyes met through the glass. Eleanor's lips moved soundlessly at first, then formed a single word that sent a chill through Clara's bones. Reverse. The hourglass in Clara's hand began to tremble, the black sand swirling upward as though fighting gravity. A ringing filled her ears, rising higher and higher until it drowned out the sound of her own breath. The mirror cracked down the middle. Then everything went dark. And the clocks began to tick backwards. Autumn drifted into the valley with a quiet melancholy. The leaves around Brookmere Manor turned to shades of amber and gold, and the orchard beyond the house stood heavy with ripened fruit. Yet, despite the beauty, something felt terribly wrong. Every night, Evelyn was awoken by the faint sound of a piano playing somewhere beyond the orchard, notes that belonged to a melody she had never learned, but somehow knew. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination, a trick of the wind through the trees. But on the third night, she decided to follow the sound. Wrapped in her shawl, she stepped into the cool night air, the grass wet beneath her slippers. The music grew clearer, sadder, and she found herself drawn towards the small wooden barn at the edge of the orchard. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, moonlight spilled across dust and forgotten tools. The piano stood in the far corner, old, out of tune, and covered in cobwebs. Yet the lid was open, and the keys gleamed faintly, as if recently touched. Evelyn stepped closer, her breath trembling. A faint scent of cigar smoke lingered in the air, and a single rose lay on the piano stool. Suddenly, a whisper brushed against her ear. "You shouldn't be here." She spun around. No one stood behind her, only the shadow of the orchard stretching across the doorway. The piano gave a low, hollow note, as though a key had been pressed by invisible hands. Evelyn stumbled backwards, her heart pounding. When she turned to leave, she noticed something carved into the wall, initials entwined in a heart, EM and CR. Her hand trembled as she traced the letters. EM, her own initials. But the other, she did not recognize. Yet deep inside, something stirred, as though she had once known the name that matched those letters, long before she ever met Daniel. When she returned to the house, Evelyn found Daniel in his study, asleep beside a pile of papers. The fire had burned low. She watched him for a long time, the light flickering over his face. Then, her eyes caught a folded note beneath his hand. She hesitated, then gently slid it free. It was written in a precise, unfamiliar hand, yet she felt an uneasy recognition. The message was short, cold, and without greeting. She's beginning to remember. You must act soon. Evelyn's heart stopped. The handwriting was the same as the one on the back of the old photograph she had found weeks ago. As she stood frozen in the half-light, Daniel stirred in his sleep and whispered a name. Not hers. The name she had seen carved into the wall of the barn. The next morning dawned grey and wind-torn. The sky above Brookmere shimmered with low clouds, the kind that promised rain before noon. Evelyn rose before Daniel and walked down towards the cliffs, following the narrow path that led to the sea. The sound of crashing waves had always comforted her, yet today it filled her with unease. As she reached the rocky edge, she saw a figure standing by the water, a man, tall and still, his coat whipped by the wind. From a distance, he seemed carved from the mist itself. Evelyn froze. The man turned his head slightly, as if aware of being watched. His face remained hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but something in his stance, familiar yet impossible, made her heart falter. She took a hesitant step forward, but before she could call out, he began to walk away, vanishing into the thick sea fog that rolled across the cliffs. Evelyn ran after him, calling out, her voice lost to the roar of the wind. When she reached the point where he had stood, there was nothing but footprints in the damp earth, large, steady footprints that led towards the old lighthouse at the end of the coast road. The lighthouse had long been abandoned, ever since the keeper vanished a decade ago in a storm that claimed several fishermen. The locals said his ghost still wandered the cliffs on nights when the tide was high. Evelyn had always dismissed it as folklore, until now. As she neared the base of the lighthouse, she saw the door was slightly ajar. The hinges creaked softly in the wind. She hesitated, her hand trembling before she pushed it open. Inside, dust motes danced in the cold light filtering through the broken window panes. On the wall hung a single photograph in a cracked frame, a picture of the old keeper, standing beside a woman who looked strikingly like Evelyn herself. Her breath caught. The woman's face was younger, softer, but the resemblance was undeniable. And beneath the photograph, carved into the wooden frame, were the same initials she had seen in the orchard barn, EM and CR. A faint noise echoed from above, the slow, rhythmic sound of boots on the metal staircase leading to the lantern room. Evelyn looked up, her heart thundering. "Who's there?" she called. No reply. Only the groan of the wind circling the tower. She took a deep breath and began to climb. The steps were rusted, the air heavy with salt and decay. When she reached the top, the glass chamber stood open to the storm. Rain swept through the broken panes, and the sea stretched endlessly below. Then she saw him. The same man from the cliff stood at the far side of the chamber, his back to her, staring out at the ocean. His voice was low when he spoke, rough as gravel. "You shouldn't have come here, Evelyn." Her breath hitched. "How do you know my name?" He turned slowly. The light from the storm flashed across his face, and Evelyn stumbled backwards, a cry caught in her throat. It was Daniel. Or someone who looked exactly like him. The storm had intensified as Evelyn stepped closer to the man in the lantern room. Rain swept in through the shattered panes, and the wind howled like a living thing. The figure, Daniel, or his twin, stood motionless, staring out at the churning sea. Evelyn swallowed her fear. "Who are you? What is this?" He turned fully now, and the pale light revealed his face in detail. It was him, yet not quite. His eyes were sharper, almost too knowing, and a faint scar traced the line of his jaw, one she had never noticed before. "You were not supposed to find this place," he said quietly, voice calm against the storm. "Your father left things unfinished." "My father?" Evelyn whispered, feeling the weight of generations pressing upon her. "What does he have to do with this?" He motioned to the photograph on the wall. He tried to bind time. "The hourglass you hold, it is part of that binding. Without it, the past and the present bleed into each other. Evelyn's hand shook. She had almost forgotten the black sand, swirling upward, as though alive. "And Eleanor?" she asked. His gaze darkened. "Eleanor was the first to attempt it. She and your father were partners in this, until she vanished. He thought he could finish what she started. But some promises cannot be kept, not even by the cleverest of men." The wind tore at the lantern room, rattling the glass. Evelyn realized the sea below had risen higher than she had ever seen, waves crashing against the rocks with relentless force. "Why me?" she asked, voice trembling. "Because the hourglass has chosen," he said, stepping closer. "And because time remembers." Evelyn clutched the black hourglass tighter. The sand swirled faster, nearly escaping the upper chamber. She glanced at the photograph again. The woman in the picture, Eleanor, was smiling faintly, as if she knew something Evelyn did not. Suddenly, the man reached for the hourglass. Evelyn reacted instinctively, pulling it back. The glass slipped slightly, and a single grain of black sand fell onto the floor. The wind roared, and the room seemed to twist around her. "Stop," she cried. "If it empties, what happens?" The man's eyes softened. "Then the cycle begins again. Everything repeats, the past, the mistakes, the loss. It is a prison built by time itself." Evelyn's mind raced. She realized the truth. She had been drawn into a web of secrets and half-finished magic that spanned generations. If she failed to act, she would not just lose Daniel, she would be trapped in a loop of repetition with no escape. The storm outside intensified, the lantern glass quivering with each gust. And somewhere in the wind, she thought she heard Eleanor's faint voice whisper again. "Reverse." The storm had reached its peak. Rain lashed against the lantern room, and lightning tore the sky into jagged pieces. Evelyn's heart pounded as she faced the man who looked exactly like Daniel. The hourglass pulsed in her hands, black sand swirling faster than ever. "You must choose," he said. His voice was calm, almost tender, but his eyes were still. "Reverse it, and the past is rewritten. Do nothing, and repetition will trap you all, your father, Eleanor, Daniel, and yourself, forever." Evelyn's mind raced. She thought of the photograph, the letters, the whispers, the barn, the lighthouse, every clue pointing to the same truth. Time had become a living thing, fragile and dangerous. Her hands shook. The storm's fury rattled the lantern panes. She remembered Eleanor's words, "Time waits. It remembers." Reverse. Clara had once handled a broken watch, but Evelyn now held the hourglass that controlled all. She knew she could not falter. With a deep breath, she raised the hourglass high. She whispered the words she didn't fully understand but had learned through the whispers in the wind and echoes in the barn. Reverse. The black sand began to lift slowly, swirling upward as if defying gravity. The lantern room spun around her. The storm outside seemed to pause, then slow. Lightning froze midair, waves hung suspended, and the wind's howl became a low hum. The man, Daniel, stretched his hand toward her. His eyes softened. "It is your choice, Evelyn. Only you can set it right." Evelyn placed the hourglass on the cracked floor. The sand continued to rise, until it hovered completely in the upper chamber. Then, with a sharp exhale, she let it tip. The sand cascaded downward in a perfect, silent flow. The world shifted. The lightning struck, the wind roared, then everything stilled. The sea below calmed. The fog rolled back, revealing the cliffs, the orchard, and Brookmere Manor as they had once been. Evelyn blinked. Daniel stood before her, his face real, human, without the spectral sharpness from before. The hourglass sat on the floor, now ordinary, emptying sand as time resumed naturally. She exhaled, relief flooding her. The past had been rewritten, not erased, but healed. The repetition had ended. The echoes of Eleanor, her father, and all who had been trapped were gone, leaving only the living world. Daniel reached for her hand. "It's over," he said softly. "Time has given us a chance." Evelyn smiled, still trembling. She looked at the horizon. The sun broke through the clouds, casting light on the orchard and cliffs, painting everything in gold. For the first time in what felt like forever, Evelyn knew that the living, breathing present was hers to embrace. The hourglass remained on the floor, a reminder of the fragile line between past and present, and the courage it took to turn time, just once.